reasons that I decided to go aviation. And as Colonel Jordan pointed out, I spent a couple tours being an operational aviator. And then the Army paid for me to go back to graduate school, and I studied aerospace engineering. And then they paid for me to go to Navy test pilot school, where I became an experimental test pilot, who is the individual who connects the engineers who really don't understand the operations that well, and then the operators who may not understand all the engineering. So it was a really interesting way of connecting the dots between all of the math, science, and engineering that I had studied before, and then the hands-on skills that I'd learned as an aviator. Next slide, please. And I was very fortunate to get selected in 2000 with my other classmates. I think all of us in our class felt super lucky to be selected, because during the interview process, you meet some amazing people. And, you know, at the very end, they probably could have picked a different group of folks. They could have picked, 17 of a different selection of people. But we had an awesome class, about half military, half civilians, a broad spectrum of different expertise within our team. We had an oceanographer, pilots, test pilots, engineers, scientists, which was super important for us to be able to do our missions when we went off to space. Next slide, please. And one of the aspects of getting ready for flight is training. You spend your time as an astronaut, you're really doing three things. You're supporting flight, which is really where you spend most of your time, helping your colleagues get to space, training for flight, and then flying in space. And then for the training in flight, one of the most challenging things that we do is learn how to do spacewalks. So there's really no way to simulate zero gravity to the extent that you can prepare for a mission. So we have this large pool at Johnson Space Center called the Neutral Buoyancy Lab, which is about the size of a lake. It's 40 feet deep, 200 feet across, 100 feet wide. And we have a mock-up of the International Space Station inside. And then we have divers that support us, and they put little pieces of foam in our suit and little weights, and that keeps us neutrally buoyant. But all of this is very hands-on, and it's very technical. And so all the things that all of us had studied through our backgrounds in order to prepare us to become astronauts were really important, along with some of these hands-on skills. Next slide. So my first mission was in 2009. I launched on Space Shuttle Endeavour, a pretty amazing experience. So you all probably never saw a shuttle launch. The last one launched back in 2011, and this was in 2009. But what's pretty amazing is that you strap into this rocket, and after 8.5 minutes, you're in space. It's a pretty incredible transition. In 2 minutes, those two little white cylinders on either side of the big orange tank are fully expended, and then they fall off to the side. They would parachute down and fall into the ocean and be recovered. And then that big orange tank is full of liquid oxygen and liquid hydrogen, and that is the fuel for the 3 engines on the space shuttle. And then once you get to space with a space shuttle, after 8.5 minutes, you spend a couple of days making your orbit circular and then matching the orbit for the International Space Station. Next slide. And then on that third day, you dock to this really amazing facility that we built in space. All of these pieces were really put together kind of like Legos. They would come up in the payload bay of the space shuttle. And then actually I'm working for a company now that had the robotic arm on the space shuttle and currently has the robotic arms on the International Space Station. But one arm would grab an element that was inside the payload bay and then pass it off to the next robotic arm and then connect it on to the space station. Very similar to building with Legos. Next slide, please. And on this mission, this was the first time we had 13 people on board. We had a crew of 7 that was on the space shuttle, and then a crew of 6 for the International Space Station. They flew on different vehicles on a Russian Soyuz that I'll talk about in a little bit. And then in our mission, if you look in the bottom right picture, in the bottom right-hand corner is an exposed facility. And that's the piece that we picked up out of the payload bay, passed off to the robotic arm on space station called Canadarm2, and then connected it. And then spacewalks to finish up all the other connections. And then I stayed on board for 2 months as a space station crew member to complete that mission, which was lots of science while we were on board. Next slide. The next time I flew was in 2015 through 2016. So at this point in time, the space shuttle had been retired and the only access to space was on a Russian vehicle. So I spent the better part of 2.5 years for this mission going back and forth to Russia to be the co-pilot in this little Soyuz capsule. The crew on the left-hand side, Yuri Malenchenko, a rock star cosmonaut. This was his 6th time into space. He had commanded the Russian space station before, the Mir, the International Space Station. I went over 800 days in space, so a complete rock star cosmonaut. And then Tim Peake at the bottom, who was a first-time flyer and a British astronaut and a great crew member and somebody you'd want to spend 6 months in space with. Next slide. And for this mission, since we weren't doing assembly missions at this point, we have the International Space Station. We saw that massive picture, and the whole purpose of the space station, even to this day, is really science. So what success is, how many hours of science that we can conduct while we're on board. And a lot of it is fundamental research. We do research on combustion science and fluid flow. And even we had mice while we were on board. And so we did experiments with 20 mice as well. This is called a glove box. And so you can't really tell here, but this is zero gravity and everything floats. And so if you're going to be doing experiments that have to be contained, they're inside this glove box. And this is just doing some of the assembly tasks to get it ready for one of those experiments. We had over 250 experiments while we were on board. And so the ground would do a lot of the work. We would do a lot of the work that required the hands-on piece. But it really requires understanding the science and then learning how to do the hands-on operations. Next slide. One of the areas that's really important on space station is understanding the effects of zero gravity on the human body. And one of those areas is understanding our eyes, because there's some negative effects from being in a zero gravity environment. Like sometimes people's eyesight changes as a consequence of interocular pressure that changes in their eyes. And so we had what was essentially an ophthalmology clinic while we were on board. Upper left-hand corner is a picture of me with a fundoscope, and it took that picture on the upper right-hand side, which is my retina. It's not Mars, it's my eyeball. And then we use an optical coherence tomography device, which is the bottom portion, which scans your optic nerve. So it was super important to have this background to understand the science to the degree that we could work with a ground team and then use this equipment that would help collect data for understanding this effect of zero gravity. We'd also exercise a couple hours every day, which was important for us to maintain our bone density and muscle mass. And a lot of the experiments were really centered around physiology. We had ultrasound scans of our eyes, our heart, other components of our body. We took blood from each other. We kept that in a big freezer. So pretty amazing experience to do all this science while on board the International Space Station. Next slide. So everything that's done on board space station is done in the context of teams. You saw that big team of 13 people on board. My Soyuz crew with 3 of us, when we were on board space station, you would go up in crews of 3. So you'd actually have 6 people on board, the crew of 3 that you saw, and then you would have another crew of 3 that would come up in their Soyuz, and you'd leapfrog those crews so that you'd maintain a crew of 6 on board. But probably even more important than the crew was the Mission Control Center, which had the folks that are really making sure that we can do the science while they're taking care of things like making sure the solar rays are pointed at the sun and we can have good power, or making sure that the thermal environment is correct so that we can make sure that the equipment works correctly, that we have a good environment while we're on board. And so they're a huge part of the team. Next slide, please. So when you're on board space station, you spend about a third of your time doing experiments, about a third of your time doing maintenance, and then about a few hours, a third of your time doing admin and exercising a couple hours every day. Some of that maintenance is outside. So on my first mission, it was more of an assembly task, and so we went outside and helped with assembling the exposed facility that I'd showed you on one of those slides. And then on this second mission, I had 2 spacewalks. The first one, we'd gotten on board, and we found out that there had been a cart stuck on the front of space station. And so we had to go outside, fix the cart, and then do some other tasks. And then the third spacewalk, my second one on this mission, was to replace a large circuit breaker called a sequential shunt unit. So we went out to the very tip of space station, made that replacement, and then did some other tasks. So pretty amazing time to be outside of space station in your own little spacesuit, which is kind of like your own spaceship, because it has your oxygen, your carbon dioxide scrubbing, your cooling system. And then we have to be very well trained on making sure that we're attached to space station, that we can move around with our hands, and then use a whole set of tools that are very specific to these kinds of tasks. Next slide. So I had an opportunity to spend 244 days in space over those 2 missions. Commanded International Space Station for Expedition 47 on that second mission. And so that was my career as an astronaut. But what you all are going to see is this next stage, and that is building a lunar gateway. So the International Space Station is 400 kilometers above our planet and goes around every 90 minutes. But the next big thing that we're building is lunar gateway, which goes around the moon. So instead of 400 kilometers away, it's 400,000 kilometers away. And when crew members go there, it'll be their way station before they go to the lunar surface. And one of my jobs right now is designing, building, and then we'll operate a set of robotic arms. They're going to maintain this space station that goes around the moon, the gateway. This is a different mission, because when you're going around the Earth, you're always within, pretty much all the time, within communication distance. This will be different in that there won't be as much communication. And so we're having to build robotic arms and systems that are in large measure are autonomous. So we all know about autonomous vehicles. This will be in large measure an autonomous space station. And so that way the crew can come up, they can do their operations, their science, and then they can get ready to go to the lunar surface. Next slide. And that's really where we're going to go. So this is sort of back to the future. I feel like I was born a little bit too early, because as a little kid, I always wanted to be one of the astronauts returning to the moon. This will be your generation's task, to go to the moon. And this time we're going to stay. We're going to have a recurrent system of people going to the moon. We're going to have resources on the moon that we're able to extract. There's water on the moon. There's minerals on the moon. And so this will be a very exciting time. And you'll see a level of autonomy and technology on the moon that's going to sustain that capability over time. So I'm happy to answer any questions you all have about space, about my career in working at NASA. And before we go there, I just want to mention a couple things. And that is that, like for me, I can talk about my personal experience, but I think it relates to people in general. And that is that big goals are really important. I think back on being motivated as a little kid, and then being remotivated when I was at West Point, and having this as something that really kept me going. And what I reflect back on is that even if I wasn't selected as an astronaut, and the chances are really small of getting selected, but even if I wasn't selected, I was motivated to do things I might not have done otherwise. And so it was a really important step for me to have that sort of motivation. The other thing I'd want to pass on is that, especially for STEM, but across the board, that education has a huge impact and will have a huge impact on your life in ways that you probably don't even predict now. It's the way I think of it is that the things that we learn are kind of like they're like tools in a toolbox. So, even if you never do calculus again, or you never do algebra again, math helps you learn how to think. It teaches you how to think. And even if you're not a big reader and you don't read a ton of literature or write papers in the future, that whole process of learning teaches you how to communicate well. And communication is absolutely key, along with teamwork. And part of being a good team member is being able to communicate well. And then history, even if you're not a big fan of history, the thing that you learn from history is that these are real people and their real experiences, and you can learn from their successes and even their failures, so that it helps you in your own life. So I would encourage all of you to continue on your path, because I know this is a STEM crowd. I would encourage you to continue with your studies and think about, even when it's hard, because studying is hard and learning is hard, and engineering and science, technology, math, all those things, they can be really tough, but they really will provide opportunities for you that you can't even predict right now. So with that, I'm open to your questions.
Thank you, Tim. That was fantastic, and we've got a lot of questions. I'd like to remind everybody to please use the chat function, if possible, to ask your questions. And student questions are the most important. And so for the first one, I'm going to take the very first one we got, Tim. It's from Kevin, and he asks, what does space smell like?
Great question, Kevin. So, at one time when I was on board during Expedition 20, some of my crewmates had a press conference, and someone asked the same question. And Daniel Levis, good friend, he answered the question, and so did one of the other crewmates. I forget who it was now. And they described it. It smells kind of like it smells metallic, or like, no, it doesn't. So like, smells are really hard to define. But what's bizarre, I think, is that when you go on a spacewalk and you come back in, it has a very unique and distinct smell, which I don't understand at all, because space is a vacuum, which means that there's no air and there's no air pressure. So, some people theorize that it's the off-gassing from your equipment, or, it's something along those lines. I don't think that's true, because it didn't matter what the piece of equipment was, it still had this very distinct odor. So I'll give my best attempt at it. I think it smells kind of organic. Like, it smells almost like a sick, sweet, moldy smell. And that's my best target. If you're asked Daniel Levis, he would probably disagree, because he had a different description. But just the fact that it smells at all is unusual, for sure.
Outstanding. And from Virginia Alvarado, what was your favorite part about being in space? And what did you miss the most?
Oh, that's a great one, Virginia. So every crew member loves looking out the window at our beautiful planet. So the very opening slide that Lance showed was a picture that I had taken with my West Point shirt inside the cupola. So the cupola is a set of windows. It's 6 windows in a circle and a big window in the center. It's like a glass bottom boat, but it looks down on the Earth. And so you're going around the planet every 90 minutes, and half the time it's light and half the time it's dark. And as you go around the planet is also moving a little bit. So you're always getting a fresh view. Like, once you pass over that place on the planet over Earth, you don't see it for another 45 days. So it's always a fresh view. It is an absolutely amazing thing to look down on planet Earth. It's better than any kind of art you can see. And the pictures, they don't do it justice, because it's really, really amazing. And so as a consequence, I wasn't much of a photographer before doing spaceflight, but it became a big passion for me while I was on board.
Excellent. And our next question is from Debbie Cortez. And she says, what was the motivation that kept you going?
So Debbie, I think the motivation that kept me going was that I had this childhood dream. I think that something about, at least for me personally, I can just talk about myself, the things that really excite you when you're young, they're really sticky. And so to me, that was something that in itself was very motivating. But I think the other piece of that, because I have people ask me sometimes about, the best path to become an astronaut. I think the best path is what your path is, right? So for me, it turned out that I love to fly and I love things mechanical. And so it turned out that this goal that I had was also the same as the things that I loved. And so they went together. I could say when I was at Georgia Tech studying aerospace engineering, that was super tough. And what I was motivated to do there was I really wanted to go to Navy test pilot school, because that was, to me, sort of the penultimate thing if things didn't work out with the astronaut corps, because I really loved the technology piece. I loved the operational piece, and I knew that it was a really interesting intersection there. So it seems like for me, I always had a big goal, but then there was intermediate goals along the way that kept me going.
Wow, so STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math all rolled into one.
They're all connected, for sure.
And so for Manuel Cobos, what did you guys do for entertainment up there?
So Manuel, it turns out you're super busy when you're on board. Your tax dollars at work. So the program success for the International Space Station is hours of science. And so the days are packed. You get up about 6 or 6:30. You have a morning briefing at 7:30. And really you're going pretty strong until the evening briefing around 7 or 7:30 in the evening. But at the same time, you have a requirement to work out a couple hours every day. And so that was my opportunity to catch up on video. Modern technology it's a thing, and it helps with some of that off time, and really like the psychological support. If you think back, you guys and gals may not know this, but when we were connected with the Russians during the Mir program, there's a space station the Russians built called Mir, and so the space shuttle docked there several times, and some American astronauts spent time on board there, and all they had were books. And they had a couple weeks between phone calls to their family. They were short. Whereas for us, because of the technology improvement, we had an internet protocol telephone, so I could call my wife pretty much every day, video conferences once a week. And then, I watched several series while I was riding the stationary bike, or we have this weightlifting machine called an advanced resistive exercise device that simulates lifting weights, and a treadmill, ironically, that you're strapped down to. And so listening to music and watching some movies and shows, along with talking to my family, were about all I had time for.
Excellent. And just for a reminder to everyone, there are lots of questions. We're going the best we can. From Iari Baraza, when you came back to Earth, did you miss the difference in gravity? What was the difference in gravity?
Yari, when you come back, it's a pretty dramatic difference. So it turns out that your body and brain is really good at adapting to its environment. So I'll start out like getting to space. When you get to space and you have to adjust to zero gravity, it is not comfortable. First of all, what can make you nauseous is a difference between what you see and what you feel, and like what you're seeing and what you feel are not the same. And then you have too much fluid, and your body ends up adapting, and you're about a quart lower over time. So you feel puffy, and your head hurts, and you feel nauseous. And then after a few days, you feel pretty normal. And then after a few weeks, you become really experienced at flying around in zero gravity, like moving around and changing your position. It feels completely normal. So then now you're 100% adapted to zero gravity, and then you come back home. And then once you come back home, it's the reverse process. And let me just say, it's very, very unpleasant because those same things that got turned off in your brain and your body, like making sure that what you see corresponds to what you feel. The way that things are up and down in gravity is your balance system in your inner ear. You have these interocular canals that sense acceleration, and some other sensors in your ear that sense linear acceleration. And then your skin, even like when you sit down, that proprioceptive feel tells you which way is up and down. All that's turned off. And so like the first day coming back is pretty miserable. Like you feel nauseous and tired, and it's not a great experience. But the same thing happens within 2 weeks. The things that they measure our agility, our strength, our balance, endurance, all those things are basically at baseline again.
Wow, it sounds like quite an interesting lot of work. And so Louis Tarango asked about space food. Does it taste good?
Hi, Louis. The food tastes really good, and we have a whole team that prepares food for us. And so it's not a slight on the people that do a great job, but it's kind of like camping, right? If you went camping for a couple of weeks and you had just camping food, by the end of a couple of weeks, you'd be ready for fresh food. So we're there for like 2 months or 6 months. So it's good food and it tastes good, but you're certainly ready for something fresh by the time you get back home.
Excellent. So we have a young entrepreneur here, Carlos Valdez, who asks, what's an astronaut's average annual salary?
Average salary. So you can look this up, and you should, because in addition to serving the Army, you can serve as a government service employee. A great opportunity, whether it's Department of Army or NASA or other places, and it varies quite a bit. In my case, I came in as an Army major. So you can look up what an Army major salary is, pretty decent. And then I retired from the Army. This is an unusual thing for NASA. I was still on active duty and retired as a colonel. And then I just transitioned to government service. And so I was a GS-15. So if you want to look at salaries, you could look at, what does a colonel get paid and what does a GS-15 step 10 get paid? So it's not shabby.
Wow, straight to GS-15 step 10. I'm liking it.
Yeah, it wasn't terrible.
Everybody should.
Yeah, for sure. I think Colonel Jordan, maybe you mentioned this, the retirement piece, like that doesn't hurt at all. So like in my case, you think about that, it's really hard for a young person to think about retirement. And I never thought about that. Like when I went to West Point, I was going to serve my 5 years, go do something else. And then it turned out to be 25 years. And then I had a retirement, and then I had government service pay on top of that. So like compensation was not bad.
And I think that across the board compensation in STEM, in the STEM world is very good because there's always a need for it, correct?
Oh, for sure. For sure.
And so Jackson from Parkland Pre-Engineering Middle School would like to know how you enjoyed the food, and which we've kind of heard, but what did you enjoy most overall?
Overall, enjoy is an interesting word, right? So it was a lot of hard work. Like I would say, like enjoyment wise, like looking out the window and watching sunrises and sunsets, that never got old. In terms of memorable experiences, doing spacewalks, I mean, that's a pretty incredible thing. And enjoyable is it's interesting to say, was it enjoyable to go out in space? Like I think so, but it was a little daunting, and it was hard work. But I'm super grateful for the opportunity to have been able to do that.
I'm going to jump ahead. I think this is a fantastic question, sir. Rachel Haggerty from Aurora, from Parkland Pre-Engineering School, would like to know which science courses you suggest that a student should take if they want to become astronauts. And also, do you wish you had studied anything different to prepare?
Good questions, Rachel. In terms of what science, someone asked me recently, they were a young person, they were in high school, and their aspiration was to become an astronaut, and they wanted career advice about, what to study and, what degree to pursue. I would say that that doesn't really matter that much. Like anybody who's interested in any potential for being an astronaut should look at the biographies of astronauts today, because it's a pretty broad spectrum of what we have within the astronaut corps. the most important thing for someone who works in space is that they have technology experience, like they've done something very technical and they've done something operational. And what that means, like something hands-on. What you really want is a combination of technical expertise, operational expertise, and then someone who's really worked well as a team. And I would say that third one is the most important. I served on the selection committee for a couple of the astronaut classes. And, you know, when we got down from several thousand down to the last 50 that we were interviewing, I think the one thought that went through all of our minds on the selection committee was like, who would you want to go camping with, right? So that has nothing to do with technology or operations. It has to do with people skills and communication and, you know, like just getting along with others. So I think that's probably the most important thing. And Lance, what was the other half of that question?
Let me get back to it here.
Sure.
And do you wish you'd studied anything different?
No, I don't think so. I was pretty well studied out by the time I got to NASA. I was kind of a professional student. And, you know, just to make the point, the Army paid for my undergraduate school. They paid for my graduate school, test pilot school, all the kinds of schools like Colonel Jordan went to, Command General Staff College and War College. So I think I was fairly well educated. You know, I think, you know, let me put it this way, like the most challenging aspects of being an astronaut were, and actually there is something, I guess, were the spacewalks. And so that's really about physicality, and then robotics, which is about eye-hand coordination. And the third one, which, you know, I think is still important today, at least for those people that fly on a Soyuz, was Russian language skill. So like knowing a foreign language is pretty important. In the era of flying on Soyuz, the Russian vehicle, it was mandatory. And so like, I think my go back is, I wish I'd studied more Russian early because it's a really hard language and it would have made things a little bit easier.
Wow, so multi-talented, as shown by the depth of the and degrees that you have. Ruben Perez.
Or maybe I'm a slow learner, Lance. I just have to keep on studying.
Well, I'm still doing it too, and I'm going on 60. So
Yep.
we've got some seniors in the Favens T-STEM program. They're building an Oberth rocket, and they just want to know what your advice is for them.
Oh, for the rocket building?
Yes.
So precision matters, and y'all are doing engineering work. Like something to think about is that they talk about tolerant stack up. Like everything that's a little bit off, they add up, and so like keeping tolerances super tight, attention to detail, that's really important. Safety, like you're dealing with rockets, so safety is super important. Having procedures, you know, one of the things that that was a motto at test pilot school was plan the flight and fly the plan. Like stick to a plan, like have a very detailed plan and then execute the plan. Like put all that time up front before you do the launch, because you're spending all this time building it. You don't want it to mess up. You want to get it right the first time. And so putting all that effort up front to really make sure that your processes and your procedures is just completely hammered flat, that is super important. I mean, you spend more time prepping for spaceflight than you actually do it. You think about the space shuttle when that was an active program, how complex that thing was, and it all had to be perfect. And we even did like countdown tests, you know, without launching. So that planning piece is super important. That and keeping things in tight tolerance. That's what I would recommend.
Excellent. Jaden from Parkland Engineering. What was your longest mission?
The longest mission was the second one. So the first one was 2 months. The second one was 6 months. So 8 months total. And there's people that spend a lot more time in space. And I think over time, we'll have people that break that record. You know, there'll be people that spend years in space, you know, probably several months at a time.
Ricardo asks, Mr. Sotelo asks, how much does the astronaut suit weigh? And I know there's a difference here because the suit weighs a lot on Earth, but I'm not guessing it weighs a lot up in space.
Yeah, but Lance, it's a good question, right? Because so the most accurate answer is in space it weighs nothing because it just has mass and there's no weight. But the mass is important because you have to move this around. And so on Earth, it weighs on the order of 250 pounds. And you couldn't walk around with that on Earth. So and even like you couldn't use the same suit that we use for spacewalks on the lunar surface because it's 1/6 gravity. And so it's not made to be mobile that way. It's too heavy. And one thing to think about, like a little more advanced engineering, is moments of inertia. So when you have weight, how that weight is distributed also affects how you move it. And so it takes a little bit of time to get used to moving this large mass distributed like it is as you go around space station. Because the way you get around is with your hands. Like you're just going from handrail to handrail, and that's your mobility system.
Excellent, thank you. And a follow on from Aurora and from Parkland is, did you have any fears in space?
Fears. So like fear is an interesting word, right? So I would say that there's like you're anxious. There's 3 times that your life is in peril. And I wouldn't exactly categorize it as fear, but let's talk about it in terms of being anxious. But those 3 times when you launch, because you're on top of a rocket, so there's that, when you do spacewalks, and when you come back home. So all 3 of those times, there's definitely an anxiety level, but I wouldn't actually classify it as fear. In fact, the main concern was really about like not messing up, doing your job right, because everybody's watching. And so you want to make sure you don't mess it up for yourself, your own reputation, for your crewmates. You don't want to let them down. The team on the ground, you want to let them down. And so it's interesting, right? That it's not really so much this weird physical environment you're in. It's really about performing. And I think that's true for no matter what you do in life. Like performance is important. Fear to me is like when you got a loved one who's super sick, right? Like it's completely uncertain. I think one of the things that we do from a training perspective is develop this level of preparation. So it's not really fear, but it's really about your level of focus, which can translate into anxiety. Like to me, like a friend of mine, Nick Hague, they launched on a Soyuz and they had a failure, so they didn't get to orbit, and they were about 110 kilometers up, and they had to come back down. Like if I were Nick, I never talked to Nick about this, but I would be scared. That would be fear. But when things are going, relatively nominally, and even if off nominal, if you have a plan to get out of that off nominal situation, to me, that's not really fear. It's more about like the same sort of emotional content you have when you're trying to perform.
So we go back to that planet and executed piece, and the training that you receive makes it easier to just execute, right?
For sure. Like, I think, it might have been fear when like the first time I went outside and you open the hatch and you look down on the earth and it's going past you at, 17,500 miles an hour, and you have to go outside and do stuff. But, I remember thinking, hey, I've done this 100 times in the neutral buoyancy lab. It's different. I'm not looking at the bottom of the pool. I'm looking at Earth, but I know what my next step is, and then just got in that routine and executed.
So I'm going to have to ask a question. When you step out of that hatch and you are going 17,500 miles an hour, does it feel like you're going 17,500 miles an hour?
No, it's kind of like, it's a good question, Lance. It's kind of like, because you're 250 miles up, it's kind of like looking outside an airplane. So like, here's a little mental jujitsu thing you could do. Like the next time any of you are on a plane and you're sitting at the window seat, like look outside and imagine yourself on the wing and looking down. It's kind of like that. Like there's not a lot around you and there's a lot of distance below you, but it's not moving that fast, relatively.
That's excellent. I just had to know. So Virginia Alvarado and Debbie Cortez kind of had the same question, so I'll pose it as one. Was there a big issue that you and your team had to deal with while you were in space?
Yeah, we had a few. The first one was we had a failure in our docking, and so longer story. We had on the launch up in the Soyuz. The Soyuz is super small. I mean, there's zero extra room. It's a Russian design, which means that it's exactly good enough without a whole lot of excess. And so you're crammed inside this little module. And I was in the left-hand seat. Yuri's in the middle seat. He's the commander of the Soyuz. Tim Peake's in the right-hand seat. I'm the co-pilot and hitting buttons. And we had this nuisance alarm the whole time for humidity because it kept on getting up and down. And so I was having to turn off that alarm. So we're coming in for the docking. And it turns out that we were docking when it's dark. So you go around the planet, half the time it's dark, half the time it's light. It's dark. It is super dark. You turn on the spotlight about 40 meters out, and we're coming in. The humidity sensor comes on, and we start backing out, which didn't make sense. So that sensor had hidden another warning that a jet had failed, which initiated an automatic abort. And so we were going out, and now it's dark. The searchlight is not close enough, and we had to come back in. That was an interesting experience. It happened so fast. I don't think we really thought about it, but it was suboptimal. But it turned out fine. The second one was after my third EVA, or during the third EVA, I finished up this task of replacing a non-propulsive vent. And I looked up in my helmet, and I had a big bubble of water, which is not great. We had a crew member a couple of years before that who had a 1.5 liters of water in his helmet, which is really dangerous because water in space is like the blob. And so like a cup of water on your face could keep you from breathing, which is bad. So after my colleague had that experience, we designed some ways that if we had water in the helmet, if we had a failure like that, we would get out of it. So we had a tube, like a big straw right here that you could breathe out of because there wouldn't be water lower down. And we had a pad inside our helmet where the airflow went that would catch the water. It's like a really expensive space diaper. And then we had a procedure. And so we just executed the procedure. And I think that's an example of, we were just so well trained that we just executed it. My wife was in mission control at the time, and she didn't have the same attitude as me. She was super worried, but for me, I was just kind of irritated that I couldn't finish my mission and had to go back in early.
Wow, super expensive space diaper. I'm gonna remember that for a long time to come. How did the Army specifically prepare you to be an astronaut?
I think that the military and the Army in particular was awesome preparation. For one, the Army is, I think, more so than the other services, is big on team. And the Army is really big on leadership and leadership in the context of that team. And what that means is three things. One, it's kind of like camping skills too, right? You need to be able to take care of yourself because you don't need your buddy to take care of you. You have to be a good follower, and being a good follower is knowing how to fit in automatically without having to be told. And being a good leader is to take advantage of the synergies of different people that can contribute to the team. And those are exactly Army skills. Like take care of yourself, be a good follower, and be a good leader. And then in aviation, aviation training is tough, and it's very hands-on, eye-hand coordination, but also, it can be fairly tense, even in exercises with lots of communication. You're having to multitask, having to fly, listen, as they say in the Army, shoot, move, and communicate. All that kind of stuff those are super important skills. You think about like that scenario we had of coming in and docking when everything is going terrible. trying to keep a level head through all that is important. And the Army was exactly that kind of preparation.
Excellent. Thank you for that, sir. And we'll go to one last question. We know that you're busy and at a conference. It's from Parkland, Mark, and he says, he asked the question, what was the strangest thing you saw while in space?
Strangest thing I saw in space. Well, I would say this, like, this isn't that strange once you get used to it, but the way water performs or behaves in space is weird. It's like this big ball, and you could put a straw into it, you can blow it up like a Christmas tree ornament, or you could squirt food coloring in it, and it's just kind of a weird experiment you could do. Looking outside, a couple of weird things. No, I never saw aliens. Never saw UFOs. A little disappointed about that. Thought that would be a great opportunity.
That's a good thing. That was a question. We just didn't have time for it.
I mean, like, no kidding. I never saw anything, but I did see something. There's probably a rocket launch that was down near above Australia, and you have these things called noctilucent clouds, which are way, way above the atmosphere, and it's a strange phenomena where you end up with little white streaks. Well, this one looked like a rocket contrail that was really high and way above the vast majority of the atmosphere. And I thought that was strange. In terms of, it's not really strange as much as it is just really awe-inspiring, is how beautiful the planet is. Like, going over Australia, it looks like the surface of Mars. Or if you go over, when we would go over Africa, you can tell that this planet is billions of years old because it looks like the whole continent's just been folded in some places. And then when you fly over the Bahamas, probably the most beautiful place on the planet, because you have these coral reefs and these different colors of blue, just absolutely beautiful. And that goes back to one of the questions of what I miss the most. I really miss looking down on the planet. If I could go back to space every year for 2 weeks and not have to train and not have to work when I was on board, I'd go every year. But the price of entry is super high. Yeah.
Well, Colonel Kopra, it was fantastic, and I think we've answered 95% of the questions. I would like to ask Colonel Jordan if she'd like to finish this off in the last couple minutes we have. Colonel Jordan. Okay. We might have lost her. We have lost a few. Thank you again, Colonel Kopra. Fantastic. Love it. And I know the students are loving it. I've got Parkland has just got 155 students that have been enthralled with this. And I appreciate Colonel Jordan kicking us off and letting us know the opportunities available with the Army, El Paso and Houston recruiting elements, and most importantly, all of our facility and students. I hope you enjoyed this presentation. And even more importantly, maybe it will help spur you to go get that STEM education and become a great asset to our country, like Tim is. So on behalf of AUSA and ARMS and myself, thank you for attending today. Anybody who